from the moment human beings first began experimenting with plants that alter the mind. One substance has stood out both for its popularity and for the controversy surrounding it. Cannabis, often called marijuana, has been part of cultural rituals, medical traditions, and recreational habits for centuries. Modern science, however, has opened new doors into understanding how this substance interacts with the most delicate and complex structure in the known universe: the human brain. To grasp the true implications of cannabis use, one must dive beneath the surface of stereotypes, common assumptions, and simplistic slogans, and instead examine the detailed machinery of the mind that this drug so powerfully influences. At the core of the matter lies an invisible network of receptors, neurotransmitters, and signaling pathways that orchestrate human behavior. These networks are not random. They evolved over millions of years to regulate survival, motivation, learning, and habit. Among them exists a remarkable system often called the endocannabinoid network. This biological mechanism produces its own natural chemicals that resemble the active ingredients in cannabis. These substances, known as endocannabinoids, were discovered relatively recently, and their discovery changed the way neuroscientists understand habit, reward, and adaptation. The term given to one of the first identified molecules, anandamide, was derived from the Sanskrit word for bliss, reflecting the sense of euphoria it can create when binding to its receptors. That very same family of receptors becomes the main stage upon which cannabis performs its drama. To appreciate the consequences of cannabis use, one must first understand how habits take shape in the mind. Imagine the first time someone engages in an activity. Whether sipping a sweet drink, playing a thrilling game, or tasting a new food. That first experience is often accompanied by a rush of excitement or pleasure. This surge is largely driven by dopamine, the neurotransmitter most famous for reinforcing behaviors by delivering signals of reward. Dopamine acts as nature's way of saying, "Yes, do this again." It lays down the first tracks in the brain circuits that encourage repetition. But dopamine is not designed to sustain behaviors forever. As the action is repeated, dopamine's role fades. The brain, always seeking efficiency, gradually hands responsibility over to a different system: the cannabinoid-based circuitry responsible for habits. This transition is crucial for survival. Without it, creatures would need a dopamine reward every time they performed a necessary behavior, like eating or walking. Instead, once the habit has been reinforced enough times, the behavior becomes automated, stored in circuits that run on endocannabinoid signaling rather than dopamine. It is this shift, from the spark of dopamine to the steady hum of cannabinoids, that transforms new experiences into deeply ingrained routines. Take the example of training a dog to fetch. In the early stages, the animal requires clear rewards. A ball is thrown, the dog retrieves it, and a treat follows. Each repetition triggers dopamine, reinforcing the action. Over time, however, the need for treats diminishes. The behavior becomes automatic, guided by habit circuits. The dog will fetch the ball even when no snack is offered, because the neural pathways have already been established. The behavior has migrated into the territory of the endocannabinoid system, which no longer requires active pleasure to keep the pattern alive. Human beings experience the same neurological shift. Consider the world of digital entertainment. The very first time someone plays a video game, excitement is high, the novelty is rewarding, and dopamine surges. But as hours turn into days, the thrill decreases. Yet players continue. At some point, they are not even enjoying themselves in the same way. The excitement has diminished, but the habit remains. The reason lies in the brain's handoff. What began as a dopamine-fueled activity has been passed into the domain of the cannabinoid system, which drives automatic, habitual behavior. The player keeps pressing buttons not because of joy, but because the circuits of repetition are firing regardless of pleasure. This distinction between reward and habit may seem subtle, but it carries profound consequences when substances like cannabis are introduced. Cannabis does not simply create euphoria. It targets the very receptors involved in the maintenance of habit. In doing so, it can distort the natural balance of how routines form and how behaviors are broken. Rather than merely dulling the senses or clouding judgment, cannabis can interfere with the system that governs the difference between choosing to act and being compelled to act. What emerges from clinical observation and scientific inference is that cannabis seems to tilt the brain more quickly toward this habitual state. Individuals who use it repeatedly often find themselves sliding into patterns that feel automatic, entrenched, and difficult to escape. Habits that may not even be enjoyable continue to dominate daily life. This is not necessarily because cannabis reduces intelligence or permanently damages cognition in the simplistic way that some critics suggest, but rather because it hijacks the very mechanisms that decide when a behavior becomes routine. The implications are striking. If habits are easier to form under the influence of cannabis, then negative routines, be they procrastination, compulsive distractions, or cycles of avoidance, can take root faster and resist change longer. Conversely, when cannabis use stops, the brain often regains some of its flexibility, making it easier to break old cycles and create new patterns of behavior. This observation, though still under investigation, aligns with reports from individuals who find that sobriety restores a kind of mental agility, the ability to alter direction and escape the grip of unwanted routines. Understanding cannabis in this way also reframes the question of addiction. Many addictive patterns across substances share a similar arc: the transition from reward to compulsion. Whether it is video games, nicotine, alcohol, or opioids, the trajectory follows a familiar path. The first encounters are suffused with pleasure, dopamine fireworks lighting up the brain. Over time, the excitement diminishes, yet the person continues to engage, often wondering why they cannot simply stop. The answer lies in the dominance of habit circuits, where the behavior persists without the reward that once fueled it. Cannabis intersects with this process, not as an outsider, but as a direct player in the very system that governs the shift itself. Another striking feature of cannabis use is the way its effects differ dramatically across individuals. No two brains are identical. Each person carries a unique configuration of receptors, genetic variations, and metabolic rhythms. For this reason, the same dose of cannabis can create calm in one individual and anxiety in another. In some, it may dull motivation. In others, it may appear to enhance creativity. From a scientific standpoint, there is no universal cannabis experience. What researchers describe as the effects of marijuana is essentially an average, a statistical middle ground formed by examining many different people. Yet within any single case, the results may diverge widely. This individual variation is the same reason why treatments for mental health, pain, or mood disorders rarely rely on one universal medication. Antidepressants, for instance, come in dozens of forms because what works for one person may fail for another. The same principle applies to cannabis. Its influence cannot be boiled down to a single effect, because each brain will interpret and process the chemical through its own distinct architecture. When considering cannabis from a medical perspective, This diversity of responses makes decisions complex. For some patients, carefully supervised cannabis use can reduce withdrawal symptoms from more dangerous substances, easing the path toward recovery. For others, the same compound may entrench inertia or intensify unhelpful patterns. The balance of risks and benefits must therefore be evaluated not in sweeping generalizations, but in nuanced, case-by-case assessments. One of the more fascinating aspects of cannabis is the way it illuminates the hidden architecture of the mind. The very fact that plant-derived compounds can bind so effectively to receptors within our brains speaks to the evolutionary role of endocannabinoids. Long before humans discovered cannabis plants, these receptors were already regulating motivation, mood, appetite, and habit. The drug does not create a new system, but rather exploits an ancient one, flooding circuits designed for subtle internal signals with an overwhelming external supply. This is why cannabis can feel so powerful. It is not introducing something foreign, but amplifying what already exists. Yet, amplification can be a double-edged sword. Just as a microphone can magnify a whisper into a deafening roar, cannabis can magnify the normal processes of habit into overwhelming compulsions. Behaviors that should remain flexible and responsive become locked, repeated, and resistant to change. The very design of the brain, meant to streamline survival, becomes a trap when overloaded with stimulation from outside chemicals. Consider again the example of everyday routines. Brushing teeth, tying shoelaces, commuting to work. These are actions governed by the habit system. Normally, such actions free the conscious mind to focus on new challenges. But under the influence of cannabis, the border between useful habits and unhelpful ruts may blur. Individuals may find themselves repeating actions without reflection, slipping into cycles that no longer serve their goals yet feel difficult to abandon. This mechanism helps explain why cannabis is not merely a question of relaxation or recreation. Its influence penetrates the very foundation of how choices are made and how behaviors persist. To see cannabis only as a plant that induces calm or laughter is to overlook the profound neurobiological interactions at play. By embedding itself into the circuitry of habit, cannabis exerts effects that are subtle, insidious, and long-lasting, often without the individual even realizing the extent of the shift. As modern neuroscience continues to unravel the mysteries of the endocannabinoid system, the story of cannabis reveals itself as more than cultural debate or medical controversy. It is a window into the mechanics of motivation itself, into the fragile balance between pleasure and compulsion, and into the hidden gears that drive human life. The human brain, in its astonishing complexity, thrives on patterns. Every thought, every motion, every desire that arises is part of a web of circuits designed to streamline survival. Within this framework, cannabis does not appear as a simple intoxicant, but as a catalyst that modifies the very architecture of how patterns are stored and replayed. The plant itself offers no intentions. It is a cluster of compounds that, once inhaled or ingested, merges with the brain's own chemical symphony. Yet the results speak volumes. Because what is altered is not just a fleeting state of consciousness, but the foundation of decision-making itself. When one explores the deeper interaction between cannabis and neurobiology, it becomes clear that the substance touches on the fragile equilibrium between control and compulsion. In the beginning, any new behavior emerges in the domain of reward. Dopamine surges, and the individual feels the thrill of novelty. This might be the first encounter with a game, the initial sip of a drink, or the early experience of any pleasurable activity. But as repetition sets in, dopamine's fireworks fade. What remains is not the initial burst of excitement, but the steady hum of habit. The endocannabinoid system steps in, allowing behaviors to continue without the need for constant stimulation. This transfer of control from dopamine to endocannabinoids is the very reason human beings can carry out daily routines without conscious thought. Imagine tying shoelaces. The first attempts in childhood require focus and reward. Over time, the action becomes automatic. The brain hands it off to circuits designed to manage repetitive tasks without the need for awareness. This efficiency allows people to save mental energy for higher challenges. Yet, when cannabis interferes with this system, what should be a carefully balanced shift from reward to habit can become distorted. Cannabis binds directly to the receptors that regulate this delicate process. Rather than letting the brain slowly and naturally hand behaviors over to autopilot, cannabis may accelerate or hijack the mechanism. This is why habits form so quickly under its influence, and why they can be difficult to escape. What begins as choice soon feels like compulsion, not because the behavior remains enjoyable, but because the circuitry itself has been locked in place. The impact of this mechanism can be subtle at first. Individuals may continue routines long after pleasure has diminished. This persistence is not driven by willpower or conscious decision, but by neural grooves deepened through repeated exposure to cannabis's influence. A cycle emerges. The brain continues the behavior because the circuitry has been shaped to repeat, regardless of satisfaction. This is what makes cannabis such a unique player in the broader landscape of substances. It does not simply mimic dopamine. It reaches deeper, embedding itself into the system that determines whether a behavior continues even when it no longer serves the person's goals. This interplay between choice, pleasure, and compulsion helps explain why many users describe a paradoxical experience. At first, cannabis may feel liberating, creative, or euphoric. Later, the same individuals may find themselves continuing use even when the joy is absent. They may wonder why stopping feels difficult, even though the substance no longer provides the spark it once did. The answer lies not in weakness of character, but in the neurobiology of habit. Cannabis has interacted with the endocannabinoid receptors in a way that reinforces routines, turning flexible patterns into rigid loops. One cannot overstate the importance of this distinction. Many popular conversations frame cannabis as either harmless or dangerous in simplistic terms. Yet the deeper truth is far more intricate. The substance neither universally destroys nor universally enhances. Instead, it rewires the circuitry of habit, nudging the brain toward compulsions that may be invisible until they are firmly entrenched. The most powerful effects are not dramatic moments of intoxication, but the quiet reshaping of pathways that determine daily life. This quiet reshaping carries consequences not only for substance use itself, but also for other areas of motivation. When cannabis modifies the system responsible for habit, it does not discriminate between behaviors. The same circuitry that governs brushing teeth, playing games, or practicing skills is influenced. Thus, cannabis use may affect how easily someone falls into procrastination, how difficult it becomes to abandon unhelpful routines, or how much effort is required to cultivate new, beneficial patterns. The interference is broad, touching not just the act of smoking or consuming the drug, but the wider landscape of personal discipline and change. Consider again the analogy of digital entertainment. When someone continues to play long after enjoyment has faded, it is the endocannabinoid system sustaining the pattern. Cannabis, by activating these receptors artificially, may encourage similar persistence across many domains. Individuals may remain stuck in behaviors that offer little pleasure, repeating them because the circuitry of habit has been exaggerated by the drug's presence. The problem, then, is not only intoxication, but inertia. The tendency to remain locked in patterns that resist change. Clinical observations often highlight this inertia. When people abstain from cannabis, many find that change suddenly becomes easier. New routines can be established with greater flexibility, and old patterns lose their grip. This suggests that cannabis had been strengthening the bonds of habit, making them more resistant to alteration. Without it, the brain regains its agility, its capacity to shift course. The distinction is subtle but transformative, and it reveals how cannabis's greatest impact may not be on cognition in the traditional sense, but on the architecture of motivation itself. Yet, the effects of cannabis are not uniform. One of the most challenging aspects of understanding the substance is its variability across individuals. Just as fingerprints differ, so do receptor densities, genetic markers, and metabolic rhythms. The same amount of cannabis can calm one person while agitating another, inspire creativity in one and dull initiative in another. This variability complicates sweeping claims. It is not accurate to say cannabis always has one effect, because each brain interprets the compound through its unique neural design. This individual variability mirrors the diversity seen in responses to other medications. Antidepressants, for example, may work wonders for some while offering little to others. The difference lies not in the medication alone, but in the unique neurochemistry of each individual. Cannabis is no different. Its influence must be understood as an interaction between substance and subject, chemical and context. Generalizations may capture trends, but they never fully capture the singular reality of each person's experience. For medical use, this complexity demands careful evaluation. Cannabis has been employed as a tool to reduce withdrawal symptoms from more dangerous substances, such as opioids. In such cases, the potential benefits may outweigh the risks, especially when the alternative involves more destructive addictions. Yet the decision cannot be uniform. Each case must weigh the possibility of relief against the possibility of entrenching inertia or distorting motivation. What aids one patient may hinder another, and only through careful assessment can the balance be struck. Another striking feature of cannabis is the way it exposes the ancient roots of the brain's design. Long before humans cultivated or consumed the plant, the endocannabinoid system was guiding appetite, regulating mood, and embedding habits. Cannabis does not invent these processes. It amplifies them. By binding to receptors that evolved for natural internal chemicals, cannabis effectively hijacks a system that was never meant for such concentrated stimulation. This hijacking produces not only euphoria, but also the long-term reshaping of behavior. Amplification, however, is not without risk. A whisper magnified into a roar loses its nuance. Similarly, subtle endocannabinoid signals, when overwhelmed by external cannabis compounds, can distort natural rhythms. Behaviors that should remain flexible harden into compulsions. Choices that should be conscious slip into autopilot. The design that once ensured efficiency turns into a trap. Everyday examples illustrate this dynamic. Habits like preparing meals, exercising, or maintaining schedules usually require a balance of conscious intention and unconscious repetition. Cannabis can tip that balance. Individuals may find themselves repeating actions without reflection or failing to break free from unhelpful loops. The drug's influence extends beyond moments of intoxication, seeping into the machinery of decision-making that governs countless aspects of daily life. What emerges from this exploration is not a portrait of cannabis as inherently destructive, but as uniquely entangled with the brain's habit system. Its impact is not limited to fleeting highs, but extends to the long-term architecture of behavior. This makes it unlike many substances that primarily mimic or disrupt dopamine. Cannabis reaches into the very circuits that determine whether actions persist, and in doing so, it alters the boundary between choice and compulsion. The broader implications stretch into culture and society. As cannabis becomes more widely accepted, discussions often focus on legality, morality, or surface-level health effects. But beneath those debates lies a deeper truth. Cannabis is interacting with a fundamental element of what makes human beings capable of growth and change. The ability to form, break, and reform habits is at the heart of human adaptability. Anything that modifies this capacity shapes not just individual lives, but collective futures. From the perspective of neuroscience, every chemical that enters the human body interacts with a network far older than civilization itself. Cannabis is no exception. When its compounds bind to receptors in the brain, they are not simply creating an artificial sensation, but weaving themselves into a system designed for survival. The endocannabinoid network was never intended to be overwhelmed by concentrated doses of external molecules. Its natural role was to fine-tune processes like appetite, memory, mood, and habit. When this system is amplified or disrupted, the balance that evolution perfected begins to wobble. One of the most striking consequences of this disruption lies in the transformation of human behavior from voluntary action to mechanical repetition. To understand this fully, one must imagine the brain as a vast landscape filled with pathways. Some paths are new, fresh trails cut through underbrush, difficult to follow and requiring conscious effort. Others are well-trodden roads, familiar and easy, where steps almost guide themselves. Cannabis affects which pathways the brain chooses and how quickly those trails harden into roads. In early stages of any new behavior, dopamine lights the way. It creates bursts of pleasure, making the unfamiliar path enticing. But dopamine does not last forever. Eventually, the brain, seeking efficiency, builds a permanent road so that the action can continue without constant reward. That permanent road is maintained by the endocannabinoid system. This is how humans learn to perform daily actions like walking, reading, or driving without expending conscious effort. What cannabis does is accelerate, amplify, or even distort this process, making behaviors slip more quickly into the realm of habit, sometimes long before the individual realizes it. This mechanism is why many users describe continuing to use cannabis even when the enjoyment diminishes. It is not that the person wants to repeat the behavior out of pleasure, but rather that the brain's habit machinery has been activated in such a way that the action persists automatically. This is not fundamentally different from other compulsions, whether it be scrolling endlessly through digital feeds, reaching for snacks when not hungry, or checking devices without purpose. The difference is that cannabis plugs directly into the very receptors that govern this transition from choice to compulsion. Consider, for instance, the act of gaming. A new player feels excitement, fueled by dopamine. Over time, the excitement fades, but the person continues to play. The behavior has become habit. In ordinary circumstances, this transition occurs gradually. With cannabis altering the same circuitry, the threshold may be crossed more rapidly, leading to a state where individuals remain locked into repetitive patterns with little reward. This explains why users sometimes express confusion about why they continue when the spark is gone. The answer is not found in willpower, but in neural systems that have been chemically reshaped. Yet cannabis does not act in isolation. The human brain is not a single machine, but a collection of interconnected systems, each influencing the other. The habit circuitry interacts with areas responsible for memory, learning, emotion, and decision-making. When cannabis modifies habit formation, it indirectly influences all these other regions as well. For example, if habits of procrastination become more deeply ingrained, emotional states such as guilt or frustration may rise, shaping motivation in other domains. This interconnection magnifies the impact of cannabis far beyond its immediate chemical presence. The subtlety of these effects often makes them harder to recognize. Unlike substances that cause dramatic intoxication or immediate harm, cannabis operates quietly, weaving its influence into the background of daily life. It does not strike like a storm. It reshapes like a tide, slowly altering the coastline until the land itself looks different. This gradual reshaping is why some individuals underestimate its power. They may imagine cannabis as harmless because its effects are not catastrophic in a single moment. Yet, over time, the changes in habit and motivation can be profound. Adding to this complexity is the remarkable variability of cannabis's impact across different people. Each brain is unique, with receptor densities, neurotransmitter balances, and metabolic processes that differ subtly but significantly. For one person, cannabis may bring relaxation, while for another, it may provoke anxiety. For some, it enhances appetite. For others, it suppresses drive. The same chemical mixture can produce opposite outcomes depending on the architecture into which it is introduced. This variability is a reminder that no universal claim can capture the full picture of cannabis's influence. This diversity of effects also explains why scientific studies often report mixed results. A study that measures creativity in one group may find increases, while another may report declines. Both can be accurate because both reflect the truth for different individuals. In medicine, this is why treatments are rarely one-size-fits-all. Antidepressants, painkillers, and mood stabilizers all show variation in effectiveness across patients. Cannabis follows the same rule. The substance cannot be reduced to a single narrative because each brain tells its own story in response. From a medical standpoint, this uniqueness complicates decisions. Cannabis has been used to ease withdrawal symptoms in people recovering from opioid dependence. In such cases, the potential benefit may outweigh risks, especially when the alternative is more destructive. Yet the same substance given to another individual may entrench inertia or intensify unhelpful patterns. The calculation must always consider both the potential for relief and the potential for harm. Beyond the medical realm, the broader societal implications are equally significant. As cannabis becomes more widely available, communities must grapple with its effects not only on health, but on productivity, motivation, and adaptation. If cannabis strengthens habit circuits, then its widespread use could influence how easily populations fall into repetitive behaviors, both beneficial and harmful. On one hand, it might aid in maintaining routines once established. On the other, it might make it harder for individuals to change course, innovate, or break free from cycles that hold them back. The question then is not merely whether cannabis is safe or unsafe, but how it interacts with the very mechanisms that govern human adaptability. Habits are the scaffolding of daily life. They allow people to automate simple tasks so they can focus on greater challenges. But when the scaffolding becomes too rigid, it can prevent movement. Cannabis, by binding to the receptors that govern this scaffolding, risks turning flexibility into rigidity, choice into compulsion, and curiosity into inertia. Another dimension of cannabis's effect lies in its interaction with memory. The endocannabinoid system plays a role in modulating how memories are formed and retrieved. This is why cannabis can create a sense of altered perception of time or difficulty in short-term recall. But beyond these immediate experiences, its effect on memory can also influence how habits are reinforced. If memory of consequences is dulled, the feedback loop that normally helps refine behavior may weaken. This further complicates the brain's ability to adapt, creating a scenario where habits persist even when they no longer serve the individual. In practical terms, this means that cannabis can foster a state where the brain continues down paths that are no longer rewarding and where the memory of why change is needed is less vivid. This dual influence on habit and memory creates a powerful combination that cements routines. For individuals seeking growth, this can become a barrier, as the very tools needed to recognize, evaluate, and alter behavior are being affected. Despite these challenges, it is important to note that the brain is not static. Neuroplasticity, the ability of neural circuits to change, remains a powerful force. Even after prolonged cannabis use, many individuals regain flexibility when the substance is removed. This recovery highlights the resilience of the human mind. Yet it also underscores how cannabis's primary challenge is not acute harm, but chronic entrenchment, the slow narrowing of pathways that could otherwise remain open. When one steps back to view the larger picture, cannabis reveals itself as a mirror for human nature. It does not create new desires or entirely foreign behaviors. Instead, it magnifies and accelerates processes that already exist within the brain. Habits would form with or without it. But cannabis alters the tempo, making some patterns harder to break and some choices less flexible. It is this magnification, subtle, persistent, and deeply entwined with the machinery of motivation, that defines its true influence. Across the wide terrain of human behavior, there is a quiet choreography that determines whether a choice remains a choice or turns into a loop. Cannabis engages with that choreography not as a spectator, but as a participant, whispering to the sections of the brain that automate what we do when attention drifts. Those sections are ancient, efficient, and usually helpful. They allow a person to shift a complex routine into the background, to free attention for an urgent task, to conserve effort for moments that matter. Yet when signals in that system are amplified from the outside, automation can overgrow its garden. Decisions that should remain flexible harden into grooves. The wheel keeps rolling even when the road no longer leads where someone wants to go. To understand how this happens, imagine a city of light threaded with invisible cables. In one region, spark and novelty surge, marking the pathways of reward that ignite when something feels fresh. Farther back, in neighborhoods built for repetition, slower rhythms regulate the sequences that carry forward without applause. Under ordinary conditions, a behavior graduates from the district of spark to the district of rhythm only after many rehearsals. Internal messengers regulate that handoff, among them natural cannabinoids that the body makes for itself. Cannabis mimics those messengers so convincingly that the gates open early, and the behavior finds itself promoted into the autopilot ward before the mind has fully decided whether it belongs there. The rehearsal becomes the performance. The performance keeps running even when the audience has gone home. This does not mean the plant erases thought or dulls intelligence in a simple, uniform way. The mind remains capable of insight and humor and care. But the balance between deliberate action and reflex tilts. A person may notice that the day slides into familiar loops that were not planned. A moment that might have been used to practice a skill becomes a stroll through distractions that feel comfortably known. Pleasure may be faint, yet the motion persists because circuitry for persistence has been fed by signals that say, keep going, keep going, keep going. Inside that circuitry, a remarkable style of communication dominates. In many synapses, messages travel forward from a sending cell to a receiving cell. With endocannabinoid signaling, the direction can reverse. The receiving side dispatches a small chemical reply back across the gap, softening further release from the sender. This back and forth acts like a volume knob for chatter between neurons. Natural levels fine-tune learning. External cannabinoids seize the same knob and twist it farther than the system was built to tolerate. With the volume altered, the rules for adjusting a habit also change. Steps that once needed active reinforcement now receive a shortcut. Repetition gains momentum more quickly. Steering out of the turn takes more force. A striking feature of these changes is how quietly they unfold. There is rarely a dramatic moment announcing that a threshold has been crossed. Instead, a person notices that intention feels heavier, that beginnings feel stickier, that endings drag. The day has the same number of hours as before, yet fewer of them feel available. Time perception itself may wobble, which matters because planning depends on a stable sense of before and after. If a minute stretches or a task blurs, judgment about what to do next becomes fuzzier, and the habit stream flows into the space that uncertainty leaves open. Adolescence and early adulthood add another twist to this story. The regions of the brain that weigh outcomes, inhibit impulses, and coordinate long-range plans develop over years and years, long after height has ceased to change. When external cannabinoids repeatedly modulate circuits during those formative windows, the template that governs automation and redirection can be edited in ways that last. It is not a single line being moved, but an array of thresholds for switching between goal-directed action and stimulus-bound response. If those thresholds shift toward reflex, the person may later find that routines dominate by default, even when curiosity and ambition are present. The spark is there. The highway of habit simply has more lanes open, and traffic merges onto it with little debate. None of this negates the reality that cannabis has roles in care. In carefully considered contexts, with measured dosing and oversight, it can lower distress for some conditions or serve as a bridge away from substances that cause greater damage. The tension lies in scale and in fit. What helps one person travel through a hard season can, for another, transform a detour into a roundabout. There is no universal response because brains do not come from a single mold. Receptor density differs. The speed at which enzymes clear molecules differs. The networks that guide effort and reward differ. Two individuals may sit in the same room, inhale the same amount, and walk away changed in opposite directions. One calmer and more open to change, the other more anchored to routine without noticing how that anchor deepens. Tolerance adds another layer. With repeated exposure, The brain often adapts by turning down sensitivity or reducing the number of responsive sites. People then take more to reach the early effects they remember. But the habit circuitry, designed to carry on regardless of pleasure, keeps marching. The person is devoting more time to achieve less felt reward while strengthening the roots that keep the behavior on schedule. When the external source is removed, the adapted system needs time to find its old settings. In that interval, sleep may run vivid and turbulent. Temperature regulation may sway, appetite may cycle, and motivation may feel like an engine turning over in cold air. These are not moral failings. They are the echoes of networks rebalancing themselves. There is resilience in those networks. The same plasticity that allowed a loop to become entrenched allows different loops to be formed. When the external signals stop, internal messengers regain their ordinary range, and the volume knobs return to familiar positions. With days and weeks, the sense of time steadies. With practice, attention reclaims territory from reflex. A person who once felt trapped by a circuit can discover again what it means to steer. The first days of steering are rarely graceful. That is true of any skill relearned. Yet the mind's architecture favors adaptation when given patient cues. Consistent sleep, sunlight at the right hours, movement that raises the heart and settles the nervous system afterward. Meals that keep energy from spiking and crashing. Each of these is not a command, but a friendly nudge to the systems that adjudicate habit and control. Environment matters more than most realize. A loop is not merely chemical, it is also contextual. Cues in a room, the arrangement of a desk, the position of a chair, the path to a device. Each tiny element votes for what happens next. Because cannabis engages the machinery that executes sequences without discussion, shaping the environment shapes the sequences that are easiest to run. If the most frictionless option leads toward a pattern someone wants to encourage, reading a page, stepping outside, beginning a task, then automation becomes an ally. If the smoothest surface leads toward distraction, automation becomes a slide. The mind is not a disembodied cloud. It is a body-based system that negotiates with place. Alter the place, and the negotiation changes. It also helps to respect the difference between promise and proof. In public debate, cannabis is sometimes framed as a panacea for creativity, calm, or insight, and sometimes as a universal hazard. The reality sits between and beneath those claims. It is a tool that locks into a mechanism most people never learned about in school. The endocannabinoid modulators that calibrate the move from novelty to routine. Understanding that mechanism reframes the conversation. It is not a question of moral worth, nor a binary of good or bad. It is a question of architecture. What happens when a powerful external key is inserted into the lock that opens the door to habit formation? The answer depends on who turns the key, how often, at what stage of life, and in what wider landscape of stress, support, purpose, and design. When someone decides to step back, they often discover a series of sensations that demonstrate how deeply the system had been tuned. Dreams arrive with a technicolor sharpness as the sleep cycle rebounds. Thoughts race briefly before settling. A morning that once felt foggy may feel brittle for a while, as if the air is too clear. This is the nervous system finding a fresh equilibrium. For some, the process is muddied by life demands and by responsibilities that do not pause while circuits recover. For others, the process is aided by structure, by routines that play on repeat in a helpful way. A set time to move, a set time to work, a set time to rest. It is possible to harness habit to heal habit, to let constructive repetition carry a person through the period when intention alone feels too thin. Along the way, it is common to look back and ask how the slide happened. The answer is strangely hopeful. The same efficiency that got someone stuck exists to help them come free. The brain prefers to economize. It enjoys packing sequences into well-worn bundles. If those bundles are redesigned, the brain will pack new ones. That is the promise hidden inside the problem. The very system that made it easy to keep doing something without asking why can be taught new destinations and new defaults. It will not negotiate instantly, but it will negotiate. In communities, a similar principle operates. When workplaces, schools, and homes are arranged to make focus easier and aimless drift more inconvenient, people find it simpler to direct their energy. This is not surveillance. It is thoughtful design. A city with pathways for walking invites walking. A room filled with tools for invention invites invention. A schedule that honors rest invites honest labor during the hours reserved for effort. Because cannabis speaks to habit, the shape of habit in a culture will influence the impact of the substance itself. A society that prizes attention and equips its members to protect it will feel the influence differently than a society that treats attention as expendable. This is why clear information matters. When people hear only that cannabis is harmless, they may miss the subtlety of how routines can calcify and how that calcification can hide beneath a calm surface. When people hear only that cannabis is ruinous, they may dismiss voices that could help them weigh nuance. Better to learn how the signaling works, how the handoff from spark to rhythm is supposed to proceed, and how exogenous molecules alter that procession. With that knowledge, choices can be made with eyes open. Some will choose abstinence. Some will choose careful use within a medical plan. Some will choose to stop for a season and observe what returns. Clarity, initiative, patience, curiosity, steadier sleep, a more reliable sense of time. The story of cannabis is, in many ways, a story about human adaptability. People are not fixed. Circuits are not destiny. Even the deepest grooves can be crossed by building a bridge of small, repeated acts that point in a new direction. A person can let the morning sun hit the eyes for a few minutes, and the body's clocks shift. A person can leave a book open on the table and return to it at the same hour every day, and the mind learns that this hour belongs to depth. A person can place a glass of water by the bed to meet the first moment awake, and hydration becomes part of the script that precedes other choices. These are not grand gestures. They are precise edits to the code that runs the show while attention is elsewhere. Over time, the show changes. There is also room for compassion in this landscape. If someone has been repeating a behavior without enjoying it, and if stopping has felt inexplicably hard, the explanation is not weakness. The explanation is a design bending under exaggerated input. That design was built to serve. It can do so again when the inputs normalize. Blame interrupts that process. Understanding accelerates it. The voice that says, "You should have," "You could have," "You failed again," only feeds the loops that run on stress. The voice that says, "Here is how the system works. Here is how to give it better cues. Here is how to pass the baton back from reflex to choice," invites a different outcome. At the end of this exploration, one can stand on a small rise and look across the terrain. On one side, sparkling ridges where novelty dances and learning begins. On the other, broad plains where repetition keeps civilization moving. Walking, speaking, typing, driving, cooking, cleaning, practicing, maintaining. Between them, gates that admit behaviors from one territory to the other. Those gates are guarded by delicate biochemistry. Among it, endocannabinoid signals that say, now is the time to transform this from a decision into a routine. Cannabis holds a forged key that fits those locks. Sometimes that key opens a door that helps. Sometimes it opens a door that traps. The art is recognizing which door is which, and the wisdom is honoring that the same key will not be right for every person, at every age, in every circumstance. What remains is a simple invitation masquerading as a scientific conclusion. Learn how your machinery moves. Notice when you are steering and when the steering wheel is turning under its own momentum. Study the moments that precede a loop and shape them. Adjust the space around you so that the path of least resistance leads where you want to go. If you choose to step away from a substance that nudged your habits out of alignment, give your nervous system time to retune. If you choose to use it within a plan designed for relief from something heavier, seek guidance that respects your individuality and monitors how routines respond. Either way, the principle endures. Habits are powerful servants and poor rulers. Reclaiming the throne of choice is not a single proclamation, but a daily practice, supported by the same brain that once made the throne feel out of reach. So the problem with cannabis, framed without accusation, is that it converses fluently with the levers that automate human life. Those levers are not villains. They are gifts. They let a child learn shoelaces, a musician master scales, a nurse move through a precise sequence in a crisis, a pilot land safely in a storm. But gifts are context-dependent. When turned up too far, the very thing that preserves effort can erase intention. Knowing that is power. It sends people back into their days with a clearer map and a gentler hand on the controls. It reminds them that the brain they carry is not a static engine, but an adaptive orchestra, ready to shift tempo when the conductor lifts a finger with care. If that is the closing note, let it be an honest one. The plant is not destiny. The circuit is not fate. The loop is not a sentence. The same biology that eased a task into the background can help bring a new task into the light. The same system that held a person in place can be recruited to move them forward. Switch by switch, cue by cue, day by day, the handoff can proceed in the other direction, from rote back to reason, from compulsion back to choice, from automation back to attention. And in that slow return, the mind remembers what it means to be the author of its acts, not merely the actor moving through a script it did not mean to memorize.